Hello, everyone. I'm Rob Server, Field CTO at Spirion. We're getting ready to start our talk on SDV3, our Sensitive Data Risk Score and Dashboard. We'll start in a few moments. All right, let's go and get started. Thank you for joining our Control Your Threat Surface with New Sensitive Data Risk Score and Dashboard, or SDV3 presentation, adding meaning to your data classification. Let's go ahead and do a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand for 1 year. And if you want to take a closer look at our presentation, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the gray bar above the slide window. And you can ask questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. Type your question into the box area, it appears, and we'll address it as we can. All right, so today's agenda is a brief overview of the why, and we'll talk a bit about our SDV3 risk profiles and the upcoming executive dashboard, and I'll give a little bit of a product demonstration. So what problems exist today? We're looking at prioritization pandemonium. Cyber attacks are growing in frequency. I've heard an interesting statistic that every 39 seconds there's a new attack somewhere on the web. So there's definitely more cyber attacks on the horizon. And that's causing a data privacy regulations expansion. So there was a Gartner quote: by 2024, 75% of the global population will have its personal data covered under privacy regulations. So the problem of cyber attacks growing in frequency are causing a response to cause regulations and controls around that problem to try and contain it. Now, tactically, cybersecurity teams are struggling with talent shortages. And there's a recent IDC survey that over half of organizations interviewed on average have felt the impacts of the Great Resignation, resulting in increased workload on remaining employees, security risks, and loss of critical knowledge. So staff is depleting. We're losing some tribal knowledge in organizations on what organizations need to protect. We'll touch on that in a few more moments. So we need to understand what the relative risks of data initiatives prioritize and manage the trade-offs. So a lot of things we hear from our customers is that the blocker is mainly volume. So I don't know where to start, or I see the problem as being too big, or I don't know if I can solve this issue with this type of data location or this asset. And all this bubbles up because cyber risk has become a C-level concern. You need to understand and quantify and measure success in a way that the business understands. Because, again, I have another Gartner quote here: by 2026, at least 50% of C-level executives will have a performance requirement related to cybersecurity risk built into their contracts. So, we're seeing movement in understanding and controlling the problem. However, what assets are you protecting? So Spirion is very good at doing data discovery and classification. This is known. However, what we have added and what we're starting with here today is our data asset inventory. And it does it solves a unique problem of putting sensitive data assets, and business process in the same view. A lot of organizations today will do this ad hoc, looking at it through, say, a spreadsheet or some other manual method. This will allow you to put that information all in one place to allow you to understand and visually see if you're meeting those objectives. So you can scan for data based on how your company does business. You can define the business process, as you could see on the screenshot over there. That's actual product. Control remediation by understanding who uses the data, who owns the data, and who's accountable for that, for the business process. We will work on and are moving forward with integrating these rules inside of playbooks to scan for the data that you expect to see on those. And you can also scan for things that you don't expect to see with our playbook integration and identify when those policies are violated. Provide an analysis and a red flag to understand when there's a problem. That's in part of the data asset inventory. But how does that solve the executive problem? How do you visualize process? So I'll wait for the screen to catch up there. Spirion is developing 2 new data risk dashboards. One of them is going to be a data risk analysis for assets and enterprise trends, and further along the roadmap, we'll have a C-suite view of enterprise risks. We want to solve these types of problems, understanding what your level of data toxicity is, what types of sensitive data you have, how much of it, quantify that with a level of risk, demonstrate that you've implemented and are solving against policy to make sure you're not going to fall out of that risk compliance. Return on investment, because you're spending time. Are you better today than you were yesterday in protecting the organization? So we're leveraging progressive disclosure, delivering the right data at the right time. This was the genesis of our SDV3 dashboard. We want to have those 3 axes of things that we're looking at: the value of the data that you're protecting, how much of it you have, the volume, and how vulnerable is it. This is the original graph that we had used internally to understand what we wanted to show. It became very much like a heat map. So with the value, how much of that value of the data is? How do we quantify that value? How much of that data do you have? Do you need it? Is it redundant? Can we get rid of that data? And of course, the vulnerability, based on location, where it is, what data posture you have on it, how vulnerable is that really? There's a great example of the CEO's laptop versus an air-gapped file server. Those are very extreme examples, but that's the ideas we were looking at. The purpose of this is to help you identify where you want to begin your work. Obviously, you want to start with the highest risk areas first, and this sort of heat map would give you that idea. So that was our starting point. This is an early mock-up of the dashboard where we're looking at your top 10 data risks in the top left, ranking your data assets by their score, and I'll get into scoring a little bit later. You move over to the right, your highest impact assets, and this was a major departure from the heat map, and I think it's really on the nose by using a bubble graph here, because it really does show all 3 axes in a 2-dimensional plane very effectively. The size of the bubble is the amount of volume of data that it has, and the value and the vulnerability are plotted on an XY graph. And on the bottom, we have that historical timeline. Are you better? Do you have less risk in the organization than you did the day before? So you can look at that and see that trend over time. So that was the target. And in that, and this is a little further on down the road today, we're going to build an executive dashboard that uses elements of existing data widgets, such as where your sensitive data is in a given location. Does it map to context-rich classifications? Are you meeting those compliance requirements? We're pulling data from data asset inventory and the SDV3 graph, which we're going to show you in a little bit, and mapping that to business process. So again, you can have a good view of where the organization is on a single pane of glass. So the first question is, how do we define value? And there's at least 2 different ways to look at it. You have the ordinal value and the monetary value. So we looked at this, ordinal values. I can tell 2 is greater than 1, but I don't really know how much more value-wise it is worth. So it's not a categorical or not really a nominal value either. They tend to be internally driven. And you ask questions, how important is it to the organization? So it tends to be a bit arbitrary. And you're looking over on the right-hand side at what the current scatter plot is of my samples that I've been working with here. So you can understand where on a given y-axis where that sits. The other way to look at it is through monetary values. These tend to be externally driven and a little bit more consistent. How much value is this on the dark web? You have specific data item values you can get from the IBM data risk assessment that comes out every year. How much is a given record worth? Or how much might we be fined if we have a data breach? Again, is that per record or is that per asset? You can assign those values inside the organization, inside data asset inventory, to understand what your impact might be. Volume. How do we define that? This is a bit easier for us. So we're able to scan repositories, and this is Spirion SDP's bread and butter. This is what we do best. We're able to look at locations, find sensitive data, and identify how much there is, and follow that playbook. So this is already a good way along the path of looking at data elements and being able to define, are we meeting expectations based on what the playbook is? The playbook should be defined to solve your business problems, such as removing data or at least identifying that it's there and applying a classification. Additional actions or protections are also possible. And we have wide coverage with minimum false positive rates. We're able to get true data, true information while minimizing the noise in that data. So again, Spiron is already in a good sweet spot here. Last question, and this one was actually a little bit more difficult than I expected. How do we define vulnerability? Well, the best way for us to define that, at least from what I thought, is to keep it simple. Every asset has a base vulnerability score of 100. Again, baseline, let's get that start of where to begin. And we can affect that by mitigation circumstances, such as organizational security measures. This tends to be things like policy and procedures training, spear phishing or password policies, etc. Those are those sorts of things that can apply to a mitigation score. And we have technical security measures. These are hardware and software solutions like Spirion or anti-malware, firewalls, DAG tools, etc. And these mitigation values can range from 1 to 10. And understandably, depending on your deployment, we allow you to set these vulnerability reduction scores inside the organization based on what you believe the effectiveness is of the mitigation. We do have suggestions that you can use out of box. However, we can allow you to adjust these scores based on what you have inside your organization. The last little bit is risk is simply the normalized sum of the value plus the volume and the vulnerability less the mitigations, and that will give you a size and a plot on the graph. All right, so I'll stop there for a second. I'll switch back to product, and I'll give you a little tour of what we have deployed. Let me switch my screen here to our existing dashboard. This is our SDP product. So I first want to go into the data asset inventory, and the first thing that comes up is the live graph. So you can see from the result, we've got really close to the UX mockups. So we have the top data risk assets that can be hovered over and given that basic risk score. And you do see that even though the value, volume, and vulnerabilities are normalized, the total risk score can, of course, exceed 100. So you're looking at that potential risk based on the sum total. Now, if you look over at the highest impact assets, you can look here and see immediately that the one farthest over to the right and the highest one is the Exchange Online store. This is interesting. Based on the amount of data that we scored, you have the most value and volume in there of overall based on any of the other items. S3 buckets we have, that's another one. We have a little less volume, but the value of that data is very high in there, as is the vulnerability itself. Maybe we don't have a proper security method around protecting S3 buckets. Maybe they're open buckets, for example. Now, let's go ahead and switch over to the monetary view, and you're going to see a different picture. So you can see based on the data inside Google Drive, based on that value, if you want to start from a monetary perspective, instead of an ordinal perspective of how much data there is, maybe you want to start with Google Drive instead. See that there's 1.1 million, based on the scores we have for the data types and the mitigations, we have 1.1 million in cost inside there. So that would be, I believe, this one over here. So again, the graph changes depending on how you want to view that risk. And the other item, as I switch back to the basic list over here, is total risk over time tends to be a little bit linear. You could see the total risk is edging up as I was doing more work inside this data set. However, if you switch over to monetary, I've ingested a lot of information, and thus we're moving into a much more risky space for the data we're holding. Maybe we should decrease that amount of data we're looking at. All right, so there's some bits here that we look at, such as data assets and targets. Let's take a look at Exchange Online asset. This is data asset inventory itself, where you can define the technical info on the asset itself, what the asset is it active, do we own this, what department rather owns this. Can we look at the hosting provider? This is a Microsoft Office 365 implementation, and what security measures are wrapped around this. So in this case, we're looking at SIM and log collection and access logging are in there. Maybe we want to add in password rotation as an item on there. And actually, I think that is an actual technical security measure to cause that. So you can go ahead and add in different items there to change the security measures and the mitigations. As we step through defining the targets, we have one Exchange Online tenant. You can look at the data content, what type of data, how much data retention is in here. And in this case, we don't have a data retention policy. Mailboxes are often set to grow, and Exchange administrators will typically only talk to you if the mailbox becomes too large. So maybe you need to look at that policy. Again, that can be attested here, and you can also identify what data is inside the organization's asset. Business process. What business process covers this type of asset? So in this case, it's email corporate fair use policy. You may also have additional documents such as what items are behind storage, how much Microsoft is willing to throttle you, for example, all those sorts of things you can put as part of the business process. So we can go into the business process and take a look at the email fair use. And this is where I can define all those things. So we're able to get in a test where with significant detail, better than what I've seen in a lot of spreadsheet implementations on those items. One last thing I'd like to show you here is going into the settings and then show you what you do with the global data types, which is how you can define those values of those items that appear. So if you want to take a look, you can set the ordinal value and the SDV3 dollar value. I believe this is from the IBM report recently. That's $158 per record. Again, you can define this for the organization. All right. So with that, stop for a few moments. And I do see some questions here. So one question I'm looking at is the SDV dashboard shipped already? Yes, it is shipped. This shipped in our Q2 release, which I believe was launched in August. And how is it deployable? Well, it deploys out of box. So we're able to ship this with your product as it gets deployed to your environment. SDV3 is a SaaS solution, and we're able to deploy that in our tenant and manage the data. We also have an option for self-hosted for us if you want to take a look at it. And I believe there was one other question. Does Spirion function telling us who uses the data and also provide us with level of permissions on the file level? Or, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the rest of the question. However, yeah, we can return security information on the file and at the general permissions level. However, that seems like a different type of solution. We're focused specifically on the data itself. All right. With that, let me go ahead and head back to the PowerPoint deck and see if there's any other questions. Let's switch back over here. I'll pause. All right. I don't see any other questions coming in. So we did have a couple of questions come in, so I think I addressed them. And I think I'm going to conclude this. Oh, wait, one more question's come in. Is it under Spiron classification? Yes, you're able to classify information and set classifications based on metadata around the file. All right. So with that, if we didn't get to any of your questions, or if you have any additional questions, we will be able to reach out and touch base so we can have a conversation if there's any other items. All right. So with that, thank you very much for attending the webinar, and talk to you next time.